Great stories are often told with humble beginnings, so it should surprise no one that on a quiet night in May of 1867, Giuseppe Morello was brought into this world. Giuseppe was born with a deformed right hand that would earn him the name the Clutch later in life. His father, Calogero Morello, worked hard as a day laborer in Corleone, Sicily, where he toiled scratching out a living to support his wife Angelina Piazza and their new son Giuseppe. Times were tough in mid-19th century Sicily, with the Kingdom of Italy taxing the peasant population heavily. With no one else to turn to, local familial clans known as the Mafia began serving as protectors of the land and people from the kingdom's authoritarian regime. Crime was rampant and human suffering occurred on a large scale, with many dying before having the opportunity to grow old. Though he did not know it, this would be the fate of young Calogero. As he kissed his wife and infant son goodbye on that bright fall day, none of them knew it would be for the last time. Angela Piazza Morello awoke in the wee hours of the morning to loud pounding coming from the front door of the small cottage they shared. She turned to find her husband's side of the bed empty. He had not come home last night. She recognized the man at her door as Bernardo Terranova, and her heart immediately jumped in her throat. Her heart jumped because the man at the door was a member of the widely feared Terranova clan, a branch of the Sicilian Mafia in Corleone. As she opened the door, she saw the man had his cap in his hand, and all of a sudden, a new fear swept over her. Where was her husband? In coarse Sicilian, the man spoke both quickly and softly. "Ma'am, I am sorry to inform you that your husband has died in the service of my family. I am sorry for your loss. Custom dictates that you fall under our protection until you remarry." The man then passed her an envelope stuffed with currency. "Take this, I'll be by again later," and briskly walked away. Closing the door, Angela finally allowed herself to breathe and then broke down into tears. Bernardo's visits came once a week, and Angela found herself with more money than when her husband was alive and working. As time passed, she began to wonder if her hard-working husband was in fact working with the Mafia, or if he had just happened to cross paths with the wrong man. The police gave her no answers regarding his death, and she didn't expect any. Bernardo was closed-mouthed on the subject as well, and she supposed that it mattered little either way. What did matter was how Bernardo always made an excuse to stay for coffee when he brought her envelope, or the way she'd occasionally catch him staring at her when he thought she wasn't looking. He would even play with Giuseppe, who she had affectionately nicknamed Pidu, and did not seem to mind his handicap, which she also found endearing. Bernardo Terranova was a powerful man from a powerful family, and Angela was a practical woman after all. So after waiting for what she felt was an appropriate period, she began responding to Bernardo's advances. After the customary year of mourning, Bernardo Terranova and Angela Piazza were married. Bernardo then moved Angela and young Giuseppe to a small but well-furnished cottage on the estate the Terranova family protected for the Italian nobles who owned it. Angela knew never to ask Bernardo about his business. She was taught as a child to have a healthy fear of the Mafia, and this feeling remained despite her sharing a home and bed with a member. This fear was brought home to her one night when Bernardo came home late with blood on his shirt and short of breath, with a wild look in his eyes. In a state of shock, she asked Bernardo what had happened before she could stop herself. Bernardo just stared at her and gave no response. The moment seemed to drag on forever until she finally said in Sicilian, "Give me your clothes." Bernardo stripped without protest and handed his clothes to his wife. Minutes later, the clothes were in flames burning in the wood stove. Angela had made peace with being a Mafia wife. Angela would bear Bernardo 7 children in the years to come. The first child, Vincenzo, died tragically at the age of 2. Shortly after his death, a second son would be born, and his name would be Vincenzo also. Following Vincenzo, 2 more sons, Ciro and Niccolo, were also born. Angela also bore him 3 daughters, Lucia, Salvatrice, and Rosalia. Bernardo treated his stepson Giuseppe like one of his own. Still, Giuseppe carried a chip on his shoulder nonetheless. He was a tough child, beating would-be bullies who thought him an easy target because of his deformed hand. It was because of this toughness that Giuseppe would be brought early on into his stepfather's world at the tender age of 14. On a quiet night in midsummer, Giuseppe awoke to a large racket coming from outside. Running from his room, Giuseppe saw his stepfather and another man carrying his stepfather's uncle, who was the patriarch of the Terranova family. "Pidu!" his stepfather screamed the moment he saw Giuseppe. "Go to the village and fetch Dr. Matteo now!" Without a word, Giuseppe broke into a sprint in the direction of Corleone. Through the quiet night, he sprinted through the town of Corleone until arriving in its most well-to-do neighborhood. "Dr. Matteo!" Giuseppe yelled as he pounded on the door of the doctor's small but elegant domicile. The doctor, waking from what was probably a deep slumber, appears at the door in his nightclothes. "What troubles you, young man?" the doctor manages to stammer out while staring at the excitable youth. "My padrino, he's..." Giuseppe paused for a minute, searching for the word his stepfather would approve of. "He is hurt," Giuseppe finally said softly. "Okay," the doctor said. "Give me a moment." Within 5 minutes, he and the doctor were walking briskly back to the estate. The doctor arrived and began working on the family patriarch. Giuseppe, meanwhile, listened to the Terranova men speaking in hushed tones. Bernardo turned to his stepson and looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. "Pidu, tonight we will do things and we will never speak of them again. Do you understand?" Young Giuseppe just nodded his head. He did understand. "Good. When the sun rises in the morning, you will be known as Giuseppe Terranova. You will be my true son." That night, Giuseppe Morello Terranova learned what it was to take a man's life. As the years passed, Giuseppe grew into a strong, able-bodied young man. He both cared for his younger siblings at home during the day, and then helped his stepfather in the evenings while learning the conduct of a mafioso, as well as the code of omertà. Though he was raised within the clan and had already participated in 2 murders, Giuseppe still had a formal induction into the mafia. A gun, a knife, and a rope were there. So was his stepfather and his stepfather's uncle, Paolo Streva, who was also the leader of the clan. He pledged his life to the clan that night, and when he emerged, he was a made member of the Sicilian Mafia. His younger half-brothers, Vincenzo, Niccolo, and Ciro, all looked up to Giuseppe, and his stepfather was generally pleased with his stepson. All were raised in the Sicilian tradition of not trusting authority, and all learned the code of omertà at an early age. Often, when working in the village, he would notice a young girl working in a cafe he frequented. Her name was Maria Rosa Marsalisi. This beautiful girl began to dominate more and more of Giuseppe's passing thoughts, and it would not be long before he was stopping by daily for coffee. Soon they were chatting most afternoons away, laughing and joking. For her part, she was fascinated by his life as a member of the Mafia, and he in turn became infatuated by her curiosity and humor. They found each other good company, and finally, after some months, Giuseppe finally decided to make his intentions known. He clutched a small velvet box in his hand, and when Maria arrived, her face lit up when she saw him. "Pidu, what's the matter?" she teased, noticing his fidgeting hands. "What is it?" "Nothing," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. He reached for her hand, and he led her onto the cafe patio. As the river nearby glimmered, and the soft hum of street musicians added to the magic of the evening, Giuseppe Morello would ask young Maria to be his wife. "Yes," she said, almost stunned, though this was exactly what she had been hoping for. Giuseppe slipped the ring on her finger and then stood to pull her into a tight embrace. As the sun dipped below the horizon and Corleone began to get quiet for the night, the couple lingered there, basking in the moment. Giuseppe had given Maria the promise of forever, but under the Sicilian stars, forever didn't last. The new couple would marry and would soon conceive a daughter named Angela. Times were hard then, and with medical care primitive at best, children often died of maladies unknown, and the baby girl Angela fell victim to this fate. Both parents were distraught, but soon Maria was pregnant with their second child, a son named Calogero, after Morello's birth father. The young family would find happiness for a short time, but as it does with us all, fate came looking for Giuseppe Morello. He was in the family garden picking grapes and olives with his younger brother Ciro when their father came to them. "Pidu, send your brother home and come with me," his stepfather said in the sternest of Sicilian. "Yes, father," Giuseppe said immediately and followed his father. Ciro bolted for the cottage as he knew his father's stern gaze brooked no argument. They arrived at the gate where half a dozen other men had gathered around a small fire. One of the men was speaking as they arrived. "We need to traverse every city and alley. Roust whoever we must. We must not let them capture our padrone." Giuseppe's stepfather immediately began organizing the men. Each man was to head to a targeted location to find the man in question. Once found, the target, a local prosecutor named Giovanni Vela, was to be killed immediately. Giuseppe was assigned to one of the least likely places. This was typical, as his stepfather always tried to keep him away from the more violent parts of their life. This time, however, Bernardo Terranova could not protect his stepson. As Giuseppe rounded the corner and entered the back alley adjacent to the home of the friend of the prosecutor, he ran right into his target. With only a moment of hesitation, Giuseppe Morello shot and killed the man. In shock, Morello fled. Young Giuseppe had been involved in other murders, but this was the first time he had pulled the trigger himself. He ran back to the manor, and the first person he ran into after entering the gate was his padrone, Paolo Streva. Giuseppe quickly recounted the events of the shooting to the head of the family. "You have done very good work, young man," Streva intoned as his younger counterpart flushed with pride. "But now, we must act quickly. Come, let's locate the other men." After a few minutes of waiting, the men themselves would all begin arriving as the news of the shooting traveled quickly. As they gathered, one man began speaking. "A local woman named Anna de Palma has been telling everyone with ears that Giuseppe killed the prosecutor." Streva spoke with a quiet forcefulness as every man listened. "Antonio, can you remove this stone from my shoe?" But before the young man Antonio could answer, Giuseppe spoke. "It must be me, padrone. It is my life and honor." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment. Streva stood silent, as if to take the measure of the young man before him. "Very well, Giuseppe. Do what must be done," Streva finished as he turned away. And with that, Giuseppe began walking back to Corleone. The next morning, Anna de Puma was found in her shanty riddled with gunshot wounds. When Giuseppe awoke, his stepfather Bernardo was by his bedside waiting quietly. "You must go, Giuseppe. It will not be safe for you for a while. Even now, the authorities look for evidence to hang you. We will care for your family. You must head to America. We have people waiting for you at the port in New York City." So it was, after much crying and embraces, Giuseppe Morello bid his family farewell and boarded a vessel bound for the New World. Back home, his associates in Corleone fixed things so a Vela political opponent, Francesco Ortanello, was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Vela. So when Giuseppe Morello arrived in America, he did so with a clean slate. When Giuseppe Morello hit the streets of Manhattan, the poverty he encountered was extreme, and the gangs mostly ran the streets with impunity, just like back home. However, unlike back home, there was a prevailing attitude of hope and a feeling that things were looking up, which differed significantly from the dour, everyday reality experienced by most Sicilians. Morello got a job quickly working on the docks, and it wasn't long before illegitimate opportunities began to spring up and he began to capitalize. Through his adoptive family's old world connections, Morello was placed in charge of the shape-up by a fellow paisan from Corleone named Rodrigo. Soon, he was receiving a kickback from a whole shift of longshoremen. A percentage of the proceeds would be kicked up to Rodrigo, of course. Giuseppe also learned it was quite lucrative to look the other way when some particularly valuable cargo arrived in the dock. Giuseppe would never consider informing the police on even his worst enemy, but many thieves that worked the docks didn't know that, and thus would pay Giuseppe a tidy sum to keep his mouth shut. Rodrigo, of course, got a piece of this as well. Before long, Morello had saved enough money to bring his family from across the Atlantic. Arriving from Corleone were his wife Maria, his son Calogero, his mother and stepfather, along with his 3 brothers. As the Terranova clan arrived in the harbor, Ellis Island buzzed with the chatter of immigrants arriving in the New World. Many waited for their families as they were processed by immigration officials. Among them was Giuseppe, his heart pounding as he waited on the docks of New York Harbor. It had been nearly a year since he left his family behind in Italy. Beside him, other immigrants craned their necks searching for familiar faces. The gangplank was lowered and passengers began to disembark. Giuseppe's eyes darted from one figure to the next, searching for people who meant everything to him. Suddenly, he spotted them, Maria, holding their son Calogero, flanked by his parents and his 3 younger brothers. Maria's face lit up when she saw him, tears streaming as she whispered, "Giuseppe." She quickened her pace, carrying Calogero. He swept Maria into his arms, holding her and his young son close. His parents approached next, his mother's hands trembling as she cupped his face. "Pidu, my boy," she said, her voice breaking. His stepfather, usually stoic, embraced him with uncharacteristic tenderness. Finally, Giuseppe turned to his brothers. They were nearly men now, their youthful faces lined from the journey and years of hard work in the fields. He clasped their shoulders firmly, a silent understanding passing between them. Together, they stood on the dock, a family reunited, surrounded by the chaos of the harbor. For Giuseppe, the city's towering buildings and the bustling streets faded away. Together, they began their walk into the heart of New York City, ready to face what lay ahead. The family settled into an East Harlem tenement, with the men getting day work through Giuseppe shortly thereafter. During this time, Giuseppe received word from a cousin in New Orleans that there would be plenty of work available for young, strong Italians. He dismissed this offer as things were going well in New York for the Morello clan. However, life would take a downward turn a few months later. It was a warm and bright spring day when Giuseppe arrived at the docks early to begin his day. He had just begun to size up the day's labor when his younger brother Niccolo ran up to bring him the news. "Rodrigo is dead. The White Hand has killed him," Niccolo said in a bewildered tone. Giuseppe stood quietly, seeming to absorb this new information. The White Hand was a notorious Irish gang who called themselves the Potashes and were led by Red Meehan. After a long silence, Niccolo would venture further. "What do you suppose it means?" Morello spit on the ground and sighed. "Whatever it is, we'll find out soon enough." Later that afternoon, a group of Irish hoods arrived at the docks. They picked out Giuseppe immediately. "The Potashes are running the docks now. If you want to work, show up like everybody else," the man with the Irish brogue said. Though enraged, Morello was not foolish. He quietly grabbed Niccolo. "Come, Niccolo, no victory can be won here today." And both men quietly moved away. After returning home, Giuseppe spoke with his father and brothers. "This is not like back home. Here the Irish are in control. We must move to New Orleans where the Italians have a strong presence. There, our family can grow strong." After a short discussion, the men agreed, and the family packed for their journey to New Orleans. Upon arrival, Giuseppe and his brothers found work with their cousin on a large plantation in Louisiana. The work was hard, but slowly the family began to prosper. They would travel with the work, going from Texas to pick cotton and then back to New Orleans to work the docks. However, during one of these trips, Ciro would contract malaria, which would spread through the entire family. With the family sick and unable to work, the decision was made to return to New York City. Both physically sick as well as homesick, Maria would return to Sicily instead, in hopes of recovering her health. She would die 6 months later. Giuseppe and the rest of his family would arrive in New York City for the second and final time. Giuseppe Morello arrived for the second time on the streets of Manhattan after 2 years of traveling and working in the southern United States. Italian Harlem was, as it had been in decades past, an ethnic enclave where government and authority were mistrusted at best and hated at worst. Morello and his family purchased a tenement in its heart on Prince Street. It wasn't long before Morello and his brothers were again involved in the rackets. Soon, the four acquired enough money to purchase a building they planned on making a saloon. Just down the street from the tenement, there was a building that fit the bill perfectly. The only problem was its current owner went by the surname of Lupo. The old man, Rocco Lupo, was intimidating despite his age, but it was his middle-aged son, known as Ignazio the Wolf, that had such a fierce reputation in the streets. Morello and his brothers knew Ignazio Lupo and the young crew that worked for him as some of the most violent men in the city. Ignazio the Wolf, truly a terrifying man, was rumored to have killed dozens and left many of them in barrels to be discovered when the smell became too rancid. Lupo was so fearsome that men would cross the street to avoid him, and women would make the sign of the cross at the mere mention of his name. When Morello, his stepfather, and his 3 half-brothers Vincent, Ciro, and Niccolo arrived at 8 Prince Street, the negotiations were short. There to meet him was a stout man with a dour expression. This, Morello knew, was the Wolf himself. "I know who you are from back in Corleone," Lupo said. "Both you and your stepfather are both men of respect. That is why I'm here talking to you," Lupo continued. When Bernardo and Giuseppe stayed silent, Lupo, seemingly emotionless, continued. 5,000 for the land and the building. Also, my saloon is right next door should you need protection." Lupo grinned sardonically at the Terranovas. This offer of protection was actually a threat of extortion, and every man in the room knew this for what it was. Young Niccolo, face reddening at the implied threat, was about to begin yelling when Bernardo cut him off. "No protection is needed. 5,000 is fair. However, we are a private clan. Any attempt to interfere in our business will not be tolerated. So long as we have that understanding, we can move forward." As Bernardo Terranova finished speaking, the 2 men locked eyes. An understanding seemed to pass between them, and the conversation was over. The threat was rebuffed, and a test was passed. The Morello Terranova clan was to be respected. On the walk back to the tenement, a silence spread among the 5. As they rounded the corner into the alleyway walk-up, Giuseppe pulled his half-brother Niccolo aside. "I saw your anger. So did Father. You must learn to think before you act. A man like Lupo can be very dangerous. Do you understand this, Niccolo?" Morello said with conviction. "Listen, brother, I just didn't," Niccolo started before his brother cut him off. "Just nothing. Think first, then speak. That is all." And for the rest of the night, that was all there was. Giuseppe Morello was correct about one thing that night. Ignazio Lupo was not a man to be trifled with. That was just a fact of life for residents of Italian Harlem during the time period. He and his father arrived 2 years prior with their family and opened up both a grocery and a saloon. It wasn't long before the Lupos had a crew of family and close friends which they used to extort businessmen and working men alike. But the Terranovas were not peasants or people to be thought of little account. They were part of the honored society in Sicily. stories from back home of the Terranova clan, and especially young Giuseppe Morello himself, had reached the ears of both Ignazio Lupo and his father. And so, Lupo chose to respect the Terranovas, and Morello in particular. This in turn caused the reputation of the Morello Terranova men to flourish. Their association with Lupo made them men to be feared. Soon, the clan had begun to dabble in their old rackets from back home, along with some new ones the family had either innovated or imitated. Morello restarted their counterfeiting operation from back in Sicily, using a local shop proprietor from the old country named Giuseppe Joe the Grocer Cantanilla. Later, he would open one of the first Italian lotteries in Harlem. His brothers and some of the other young toughs from the neighborhood also acted as muscle for Lupo's extortion racket. As the two families grew closer, Lupo became increasingly fond of Terranova's sister, Salvatrice. The two would often gossip of locals in the neighborhood, and around her, his exterior seemed to soften. But as soon as another person was in earshot, up went the mask of the wolf, and when that mask was up, Ignazio radiated a danger that was easily perceived by those around him. Lupo was always respectful, courteous, and generous when it came to Salvatrice, earning both Father Bernardo's and Brother Giuseppe's respect. As the group of men became closer, many of their rackets began to overlap, and together they grew very rich, very quickly. Many nights, the men who made up parts of the burgeoning New York underworld would gather at the saloon on 8 Prince Street to commiserate and plan their next scores. Morello and his brothers were there often, as was the elder Lupo and his son. Top Morello enforcers Tomasio the Ox Peto was also there, along with thugs such as Vito La Duca and Giuseppe Di Primo. Men of respect from the old country would mix with brutal cutthroats in this underworld harbor. Often, the usual cast of characters would sit around the table playing cards and drinking, imagining new ways to turn a buck on the wrong side of the law. Meanwhile, across town, a police officer enters an interrogation room and begins to savagely beat a suspect, while simultaneously verbally berating him in Italian. "We know you killed him, Vito," the middle-aged cop said in an almost instructive tone. The man receiving the beating, however, remained silent. "We have 2 witnesses that put you at the scene of the crime," he continued, while landing another blow with the thick law volume, administering his own version of street justice. "Or perhaps you'd like to tell us about the counterfeit $5 bill we found on you instead," the officer continued. This officer, Sergeant Giuseppe Joe Petrosino, had no use for the young Italian hoods that were giving his people a bad name. Hoods like this Vito Cassioferro, who was currently stinking up his interrogation room. They were in the process of charging this man with murder. However, Petrosino felt like he was going through the motions. In his heart of hearts, he knew the murder would never stick. In situations like this, witnesses would usually disappear, and suspects would then go free. If that was an impossibility, then it would be the suspect who would make bail and disappear, usually back to the waiting arms of his family in the old country. Cassioferro was involved with the Black Hand in Italian Harlem, and for Petrosino, bringing down the Black Hand was his private obsession. Giuseppe Joe Petrosino, however, was as patient as he was tough, and later tonight, he'd be meeting an informant he had developed who was going to help him bring down the largest Black Hand gang in Manhattan, and one this Mr. Cassioferro knew very well, the gang he thought of as the Morello crew. Petrosino, being a wise old head, knew better than to meet his informant anywhere near East New York or Harlem. Instead, they met at an Irish pub in Woodlawn Heights. The man he was meeting was already seated in a booth with a shot and a chaser, so Petrosino piled in across from him and waited. After 20 seconds of silence, the man began speaking. Joe the Grocer gets drunk down at the saloon and likes to start bragging about how he's Giuseppe Morello's right hand and how they're gonna get rich printing these counterfeit bills. I don't know where they make them, but Joe will let it slip. Eventually. Petrosino, ever the patient man, waited for more. When nothing more was forthcoming, Petrosino made his only statement. You want the robbery charge to go away? You find out where they're making the bills. The man started to protest, but before he could begin, Petrosino was gone. As weeks went by, Petrosino and his squad of officers began observing 8 Prince Street and harassing its patrons. Daily, they would roust local thugs out of their domiciles up and down Prince Street, harassing members of Lupo and Morello's crews. The extra heat on his establishment and his men was not lost on Giuseppe Morello. That afternoon, as they watched the beat cop frisk one of their boys, Niccolo remarked to his older brother, "They're everywhere now." Morello, who had this very thought some weeks ago, then wondered aloud, "Why do you suppose that is?" Niccolo, not necessarily in an answer to that question, remarked, "Joe has a big mouth, doesn't he?" "Yes, he does," Morello said with quiet finality. Later that night, Morello met with Lupo alone. As the two sat at a private table in the rear of Morello's restaurant, Morello resorted to an old Sicilian proverb about removing a stone from his shoe. Lupo, impressed by this witticism, decides he will use it later. As for the job, getting rid of the gregarious loudmouth Joe the grocer will be a pleasure he will take personally. A few days would pass, and with the end of the week at hand, the saloon was packed with criminals and knock-around guys of every sort. Joe the grocer Catania was, as always, at the end of the bar, talking to anyone within earshot at the top of his lungs. Ignazio Lupo, while well known in Italian Harlem, was often willfully ignored by most patrons due to the pervasive fear of him among the local populace. It was partly due to this that he was able to settle in the corner of the saloon relatively unnoticed, and where he began to listen to Joe the grocer drunkenly brag and rant to any and all. After an hour had passed and he was sure the man was already intoxicated, Ignazio Lupo approached his friend at the bar and called for a drink. "Giuseppe, how are you? May I come sit down?" Lupo said, already sitting. Immediately on guard despite his drunkenness, Catania replied, "Of course, Don Lupo," giving respect to Lupo despite Catania being the older man. The two men began to chat, with Lupo reminding Catania to pick up the dry goods that they had gotten out of bond for their respective groceries. After 2 drinks and more chit-chat, Lupo excused himself, embracing Catania and kissing him on the cheek before leaving the restaurant. After Lupo leaves the saloon, Catania visibly relaxes along with the rest of the bar. After another 2 hours of drinking, Catania begins the trek home. As he rounded into the alleyway and entered his home, some instinctual inner alarm began going off inside his head. Perhaps because he was drunk, or perhaps because he had stopped listening to that particular alarm clock years ago, Catania continued inside. The last thing he would see would be a strange man sitting at his table. The next moment, Lupo stepped from the closet and shot Catania in the back of the head. Lupo then spit on the corpse before yelling, "Put him in a barrel and leave him at the dump." His men immediately complied. It would be weeks before the body was found in the Red Hook neighborhood of Brooklyn. Detective Petrosino arrived as soon as he heard of the discovery. The identification was going to take some time as the man's face was completely unrecognizable. Petrosino was already in a foul mood that morning after learning that Cassioferro had been bailed out. Now, with another body discovered in a barrel, pressure would be ratcheted up to find those responsible, or rather, to find someone to hold responsible. Petrosino hated the corruption he was forced to deal with on a day-to-day basis, but it never did deter him. "Just scum killing scum," he heard another detective say. "No great loss." This detective's attitude bothered Petrosino nearly as much as the crime itself, and he had to restrain himself from berating the detective standing next to him who made the comment. He long ago realized that the Morello gang would be a tough nut to crack. The gang's leaders were very selective of who they would work with, and all followed the ancient Sicilian practice of omertà, making infiltration difficult. As 1902 turned to 1903, Giuseppe Morello assumed day-to-day leadership of the clan due to Bernardo's declining health. The Morello Terranova clan numbered nearly 40 by that time and had continued to expand their criminal horizons into new areas such as loan sharking and gambling, while strengthening their existing rackets involving extortion, numbers, and counterfeiting. During Bernardo's illness, his daughter Salvatrice cared for him night and day. Ignazio Lupo, now openly courting Salvatrice, supported her as she supported him. It was a day in late spring when Lupo appeared at the doorway of Bernardo's quarters. The two had grown much closer since their first meeting at the saloon, and Lupo approached the older man with obvious respect.
Padrone, you are a wise man, and I am sure you know why I have come to you in this late hour. Your health is failing, and I do not want to lose you to God before asking this question,
Lupo said in a manner that would have shocked any of the men who worked for him.
You wish to marry my daughter? Bernardo said in a wheeze.
Salvatrice was the apple of her father's eye, as everyone knew, and his refusal would brook no argument.
Take her by the hand, Ignazio, and do not let her go,
Bernardo finished in a hoarse whisper. And with that, the matter was finished. Bernardo Terranova would pass away less than a month later, with his adopted son Giuseppe officially accepting the reins of leadership. The Morello Terranova clan and the Lupo gang slowly merged into a single cohesive criminal organization. The marriage of Salvatrice Terranova to Ignazio Lupo was more than a union of a man and a woman. It was the creation of the first American mafia family. After the wedding and the honeymoon, another ceremony took place. At the table during this ceremony was a knife and a gun. A saint was burned, and after it was finished, the Morello crime family had been born. The boss, or father of the family, Giuseppe Morello, appointed Ignazio Lupo as his underboss. There, Lupo would operate as his right hand and chief enforcer, and with their combined strength, the two of them were poised to rule the rackets throughout the city.